The courtroom fell silent as the heavy oak doors swung open. Alistair Grayson strode in, his polished Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor, exuding the arrogance of a man who had spent his entire life above the rules. His tailored navy blue suit hugged his tall frame perfectly, and a gold Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, a silent testament to his power. To him, this was nothing more than an inconvenience, a legal hiccup that would soon be swept away like all the others. As he reached the defendant's table, Alistair let out a slow breath, his sharp gray eyes scanning the room with detached amusement. But then, his gaze landed on the judge's bench, and for the first time, his smirk faltered. Judge Celine Whittaker. Her presence was striking. Dark brown skin, an air of unwavering authority, and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. She was younger than he expected, but there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence behind her gaze. Alistair leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs with deliberate ease. A sly smile curled at the edges of his lips as he muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear. "This is a joke, right? A woman like you presiding over a case like mine." A ripple of tension spread through the courtroom. His attorney, Everett Langley, tensed beside him, visibly wincing. The murmurs from the crowd died instantly when the sharp crack of a gavel echoed through the room. Judge Whittaker did not flinch. She rested both hands on the bench and leaned forward ever so slightly. Her voice was steady, commanding, and cold as steel. "And I assume a man like you believes money can buy him out of anything, doesn't he, Mr. Grayson?" For the first time in years, Alistair felt something unfamiliar, an unease creeping into his chest. He had walked into this courtroom expecting another effortless victory. But as he met Judge Whittaker's unshakable stare, something in his gut told him this trial would not go as planned. Alistair sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he drummed his fingers against the polished mahogany table. Patience had never been his strong suit. He had spent his entire life commanding rooms, turning negotiations in his favor with nothing but a glance and a checkbook. Yet, here he was, forced to endure this farce of a trial, surrounded by people who actually believed the law applied to men like him. He adjusted his cuffs, feeling the smooth silk lining of his custom-tailored suit, a quiet reminder of the power he wielded. Money had always spoken louder than justice. Across the room, Nathaniel Calloway rose from his seat. Tall, lean, and with a demeanor that suggested he had never once lost a case he truly cared about, Calloway was a problem. A man of principle, dangerous and unpredictable. Unlike the spineless prosecutors Alistair had dealt with before, this one wouldn't fold under pressure, wouldn't hesitate to drag him through the mud for the sake of an example. Men like Calloway were annoyingly persistent. "Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to present clear and compelling evidence that Mr. Grayson engaged in a systematic, premeditated scheme to defraud thousands of investors. These individuals, working-class families, retirees, and small business owners, placed their trust in him only to be left in financial devastation." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the most disinterested spectators sat a little straighter. Words like working-class families and retirees always stirred emotions. It was a clever move, Alistair admitted to himself. Make him look like a monster, play the sympathy card. He had seen this strategy before, but it had never been a problem. He always won. He leaned slightly toward his lawyer, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Langley, this is a waste of time. There are people we can call, strings to pull. How much will it take to make this go away?" His attorney, Everett Langley, hesitated. The hesitation alone was enough to make Alistair's blood run cold. Langley had been his lawyer for years, a man who handled high-profile crises with ice in his veins. But today, there was sweat forming at his temple, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Alistair." Langley swallowed hard before lowering his voice even further. "Judge Whittaker isn't like the others. She can't be bought." Alistair's spine stiffened. Not like the others? Not for sale? That was absurd. Everyone had a price. He had built an empire on that very principle. There was always a weak spot: debt, ambition, family, scandal. Something to exploit. Yet, as he turned his gaze to Judge Selene Whitaker, he saw none of the usual tells. No flicker of doubt. No hesitation. Just cold, unwavering certainty. For the first time in years, a foreign sensation twisted in his gut. Doubt. And that realization unsettled him more than anything Calloway could ever say. Alistair sat rigidly in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if steadying himself against a force he refused to acknowledge. Control. Power. Influence. These were the things that had always kept him untouchable. He had dictated the rules of every game he played: business, politics, society. Yet, for the first time in decades, he felt the unmistakable sensation of losing his grip. His gaze flickered to Judge Selene Whitaker, who had barely spoken since the hearing began, yet her presence filled the entire room. She wasn't like the others, judges he had privately wined and dined at elite clubs, those who owed him favors, who looked at him and saw a king rather than a criminal. No, Whitaker saw something else entirely. There was no deference in her eyes, no fear, no hesitation. Just quiet, razor-sharp calculation. Then, Nathaniel Calloway stood again, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the wooden floor. He carried himself with the deliberate confidence of a man who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. He adjusted his tie, turned toward the judge, and delivered the first hammer blow. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence, bank statements that directly link Mr. Grayson to offshore accounts used for laundering fraudulent investment funds." A chill spread through the courtroom. The shuffle of papers, hushed whispers, and the tension in the air hit Alistair like a physical force. He didn't move, didn't blink, but inside, something deep and primal twisted in his gut. His mind raced. That wasn't possible. Those accounts had been shielded by layers upon layers of intermediaries, shell corporations, legal loopholes. They were untraceable. Or at least, they were supposed to be. His lawyer, Everett Langley, exhaled slowly beside him. "What the hell is this?" Alistair muttered under his breath, his voice sharp, clipped. Langley didn't respond right away. That silence spoke volumes. Alistair turned to him, his jaw tightening, his fingernails pressing into his palms. "Tell me you saw this coming." Langley hesitated. Again. That damn hesitation. Then, finally, he leaned in and whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the weight of what he was about to say. "Alistair, they have more than we thought." For the first time, Alistair Grayson felt the walls closing in. The safety net he had relied on for years was unraveling right before his eyes. And this time, he wasn't sure if he would land on his feet. Alistair sat motionless, his fingers curled into a fist beneath the table, hidden from sight. He had been in tough situations before, but never like this. Never in a place where his money, his influence, and his connections meant nothing. The courtroom suddenly felt smaller, suffocating even. His entire life had been about control. Controlling markets, controlling people, controlling outcomes. But here, under the cold fluorescent lights and the unrelenting gaze of Judge Selene Whitaker, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. A rare, unwelcome sensation. Judge Whitaker rested her elbows on the bench, her fingers laced together as she studied him. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to be. The weight of silence pressed down on Alistair, stretching each second into an eternity. She was giving him space to self-destruct. To let the realization sink in, he wasn't in control anymore. Then came the next blow. Nathaniel Calloway, still standing with a posture of unshakable confidence, held up a folder thick with documents. Alistair knew that look. It was the look of a man holding all the cards. "Your Honor, We have additional evidence to submit. Exhibit B. Internal emails that directly implicate Mr. Grayson in the orchestration of this financial scheme. These communications prove beyond a doubt that he was not only aware of the fraud but actively ensured it continued for years. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, voices hushed yet thick with judgment. Alastair had spent years shaping a public image of power, intellect, and unshakable dominance. But all it took was a few pieces of paper, a few damning sentences on a screen, to shatter that illusion. He could already feel the shift in the room, the weight of eyes that no longer saw him as an untouchable business mogul, but as a criminal. His teeth clenched so hard that a dull ache formed in his jaw. He leaned toward Langley, his voice so sharp and quiet that it barely escaped his lips. "How the hell did they get those?" Langley didn't answer immediately. That hesitation again. The same hesitation that had been gnawing at Alastair since this trial began. Then, finally, after a slow, careful exhale, Langley leaned in and whispered. Someone on the inside flipped. Alastair's grip on the table tightened. His pulse, usually steady and controlled, now pounded violently against his temple. Betrayal. The very idea was unthinkable. He had built his empire on loyalty. Bought, enforced, and absolute. Everyone had a price. Everyone had something to lose. Or so he thought. Judge Whittaker's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "Mr. Langley, does the defense have any objections to the submission of this evidence?" Langley hesitated, longer this time. He knew the weight of that question. He turned to Alastair, as if searching for an escape route, but none existed. The pause stretched on, until finally, Langley exhaled sharply and gave the words that sealed it. "No, Your Honor." The gavel came down with force, and the sound echoed through the silent courtroom. For the first time, Alastair Grayson understood the depth of his predicament. For the first time, he realized there was no deal to be made, no money to throw, no favor to call in. For the first time, he felt fear. Alastair had always been a man who dictated the terms of the game. Boardrooms, private clubs, political dinners, these were the arenas where power was won, where rules were bent, where men like him thrived. He was the one people feared, the one who decided who rose and who fell. Yet, as he sat there, in that cold, sterile courtroom, he could feel his grip slipping. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in decades, he had no control. Nathaniel Calloway remained standing, his presence an unshakable force in the room. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was drawing out the moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. His eyes flickered toward Alastair for the briefest second before he turned back to Judge Whittaker. "Your Honor, the prosecution would now like to introduce Exhibit C, recorded phone conversations between Mr. Grayson and his senior executives, detailing their strategy to cover up financial discrepancies and deceive federal regulators." The reaction was immediate. A heavy murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even those who had sat quietly, indifferent up until this point, now leaned forward with renewed interest. This wasn't just money being shuffled around. This was conspiracy. Intent. A deliberate, calculated effort to manipulate the system, to lie, to steal. Alastair felt a rare chill creep up his spine. No. That couldn't be right. Those conversations were protected, encrypted, buried under legal firewalls. There was no way, no way, that the prosecution could have gotten their hands on them. He turned to Langley, his fingers tightening against the table. "Tell me this is a bluff." Langley's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something different this time. A hesitation, a stiffness in his shoulders, a bead of sweat at his temple. And then he leaned in. His voice was just a whisper, barely audible beneath the courtroom's shifting energy. "They have everything." For the first time, Alastair's chest felt tight. He had been in crises before. Lawsuits, scandals, hostile takeovers, but nothing like this. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was criminal. The weight of reality sank into him like a slow, suffocating pressure. He wasn't walking away from this. Alistair Grayson's entire life had been built on power, the ability to command, to control, to dictate outcomes with nothing but a word or a signature. He had always believed that wealth was the greatest shield a man could have, that it placed him above consequences, above the petty rules designed for lesser men. But as he sat in that courtroom, watching the prosecution unravel his empire thread by thread, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades: powerless. The room felt heavier than before, suffocating in a way he couldn't quite explain. The walls hadn't moved, yet they felt closer. The air hadn't changed, yet it felt thicker. Even the people in the gallery, once mere spectators in a game he was certain he would win, now looked different. Their eyes no longer held the usual quiet admiration or fear. Now, there was something else. Judgment. Condemnation. Anticipation. Judge Celine Whitaker remained impossibly still, watching, waiting. She wasn't impressed by his name. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth. He had seen countless judges before, men and women who saw him as untouchable, who knew better than to challenge someone of his status. But Whitaker wasn't blinking. She wasn't shifting in her chair. She wasn't hesitating. Nathaniel Calloway moved with precision, like a hunter closing in on wounded prey. He knew he had Alistair cornered. With a measured breath, he straightened his posture and spoke again, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. Your Honor, the prosecution is now submitting Exhibit D, transcripts of recorded phone conversations in which Mr. Grayson personally threatened former employees who attempted to come forward with information regarding his fraudulent activities. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The energy in the room shifted again, heavier, sharper. It was one thing to manipulate numbers, to move money around in ways that made it seem like nothing was illegal. But threats? Coercion? That was something else entirely. That was no longer business. It was something far darker. Alistair felt his teeth clench, his pulse drumming in his ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The script had always been the same. He would walk into a courtroom, surrounded by lawyers who had already ensured his freedom, and he would leave untouched. But now, nothing felt certain anymore. He turned to Langley, his jaw tightening as he spoke through gritted teeth. This is getting out of control. Tell me there's a way to stop this. Langley hesitated. That hesitation again. That goddamn hesitation that had been happening more and more throughout this trial. Then, finally, without looking at Alistair, he exhaled slowly and spoke words that made his blood run cold. We're out of options, Alistair. For the first time in his life, Alistair Grayson understood what it felt like to be truly trapped. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he would make it out of this. Alistair Grayson had built his empire on certainty. He had spent decades knowing that the system was rigged in favor of men like him. Powerful, ruthless, untouchable. But as he sat there, trapped under the weight of Judge Celine Whitaker's stare, certainty had abandoned him. The courtroom was too loud and too quiet all at once. The murmurs of the spectators, the whispers between journalists scribbling notes, the quiet clicking of cameras, every sound felt amplified. For the first time, Alistair realized they weren't here just to witness a trial. They were here to watch him fall. Nathaniel Calloway remained standing, his confidence unwavering. He had spent years building this case brick by brick, and now he was watching the final structure crumble before his eyes. With one last measured breath, he dropped the final bombshell. Your Honor, the prosecution is now submitting Exhibit E, signed statements from multiple former executives at Grayson Enterprises, detailing the full extent of Mr. Grayson's involvement in fraudulent activities and obstruction of justice. Alistair's stomach turned to stone. Signed statements. His own people. His fingers twitched against the smooth surface of the table. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. These were men and women he had groomed, paid, protected. They had built their wealth under his leadership. And now, they were selling him out to save themselves. He turned to Langley, his voice low, razor-sharp. "Who flipped?" Langley didn't answer right away. That hesitation again. Then, finally, the truth came in a hushed whisper. "All of them." Something inside Alistair snapped. His jaw clenched, his fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Every single one of them had turned on him. They had taken his money, his protection, his guidance, and now they were lining up to testify against him, to watch him burn. Judge Whittaker cleared her throat, her voice steady and firm. "Mr. Grayson, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Alistair lifted his gaze, meeting hers. For the first time, he had no answer. For the first time, he had no plan. Alistair sat rigid in his chair, his fingers gripping the edges of the defense table with such force that his nails dug into the polished wood. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. His entire life had been a testament to that fact. Every scandal, every lawsuit, every regulatory investigation had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a game he had always won. But now, for the first time, he couldn't see the next move. The betrayal still felt like a fresh wound, deep and festering. His own executives, hand-picked, trained, and rewarded for their loyalty, had turned against him. They hadn't hesitated. There was no last-minute warning, no discreet message letting him know the ship was sinking. They had abandoned him the moment it became convenient, leaving him alone to take the fall. And now, as he sat there, trapped under the weight of their testimonies, the reality was undeniable. He wasn't the puppeteer anymore. He was the puppet. Nathaniel Calloway stepped forward, moving with the steady confidence of a man who had been waiting for this moment. He didn't rush. He let the tension stretch, let the weight of silence press against Alistair like an iron grip around his throat. Then, when the moment was right, he spoke, his voice calm, steady, and absolute. "Your Honor, these witness statements provide irrefutable proof of Mr. Grayson's direct involvement in fraud, obstruction of justice, and corporate conspiracy. Given the severity of these crimes and their widespread impact, the prosecution formally recommends the maximum penalty allowed by law." Alistair's heart slammed against his ribs. Maximum penalty. The words rang in his skull like a judge's gavel pounding against cold stone. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent decades making sure that no matter what he did, no matter how many laws he bent, no matter how many lives he ruined, he would always walk away untouched. Yet here he was, with no leverage left, no favors to call in, no escape. Judge Celine Whittaker remained silent, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't angry, she was simply watching. Watching as the once mighty Alistair Grayson sat in the ruins of his own making. Watching as he struggled to comprehend that the rules he had rewritten for himself no longer applied. For a fleeting moment, rage bubbled inside him, the instinct to fight, to threaten, to make them all regret ever challenging him. But that instinct died as quickly as it came. Because deep down, beneath the arrogance and denial, he knew the truth. This was it. For the first time in his life, Alistair Grayson had lost. Alistair Grayson had never known what it was like to feel small. He had spent his life towering over others, not just in wealth, but in power, in presence. He had walked into boardrooms where entire industries trembled at his decisions. He had sat in private clubs where senators and judges leaned in, eager to hear what he had to say. He had never begged, never pleaded, never once believed that he could lose. But now, sitting in that courtroom, waiting for his sentence, he had never felt more insignificant. The air was thick, charged with something he couldn't quite describe. Anticipation? Contempt? Relief? The spectators in the gallery no longer whispered, they simply stared. Some with disgust, others with satisfaction. They wanted to see the fall. They wanted to watch the great Alistair Grayson stripped of everything. Judge Celine Whittaker sat in quiet contemplation. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. This moment belonged to her now. After what felt like an eternity, she straightened her posture and adjusted her glasses. Mr. Grayson, the evidence against you is overwhelming. The financial crimes committed under your leadership have devastated countless lives. You defrauded investors, manipulated markets, and silenced those who tried to expose the truth. Alistair's jaw locked, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Whittaker continued, her voice measured, steady, and absolute. For years, you operated under the belief that you were above the law, that your wealth and influence could shield you from consequences. Today, that illusion ends. She paused, then delivered the final blow. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The words landed like a hammer. The courtroom erupted. A sharp, collective inhale from the gallery. Murmurs. A quiet gasp from somewhere behind him. The reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked, voices whispered. But Alistair heard none of it. 25 years. His hands curled into fists on his lap. 25 years in a cell. No more penthouses. No more private jets. No more boardrooms filled with men waiting on his word. No more control. He turned, just slightly, catching a glimpse of Nathaniel Calloway. The prosecutor wasn't smiling, but there was something in his eyes, satisfaction. Not because he had won, but because justice had finally caught up with Alistair Grayson. And then, finally, he looked back at Judge Whittaker. She was still watching him. Not with triumph. Not with gloating. Just quiet, unshakable certainty. This was the moment she had been waiting for. And this was the moment Alistair Grayson had spent his life believing would never come. The prison bus rattled down the long, desolate road, the steel bars on its windows casting dark shadows across Alistair Grayson's face. The vibration of the engine hummed beneath him, a dull, relentless reminder that this was real. He wasn't dreaming. This wasn't some temporary inconvenience. This was the end of the life he had spent decades building. The metal cuffs around his wrists felt heavier than they should have, biting into his skin, a cruel contrast to the platinum watches he once wore. His fingers twitched, reflexively searching for the smooth weight of a cigar, a glass of aged scotch, but those luxuries were gone. In their place was the rough fabric of his beige prison jumpsuit, a uniform that stripped him of everything that once made him Alistair Grayson. Outside the window, the city he once ruled over faded into the distance. Skyscrapers he had once owned stood tall on the horizon, but they may as well have been from another lifetime. He had dined in the most exclusive restaurants, whispered in the ears of senators, controlled entire industries with the stroke of a pen. And now he was just another inmate on his way to a cage. The bus lurched to a stop. The air was thick with the scent of rust, sweat, and something else, the unmistakable staleness of a place where men entered but never truly left. Through the windshield, Alistair saw it. Redwood Federal Penitentiary. A fortress of concrete and steel, surrounded by razor-wire fences and armed watchtowers. Even the sky above it seemed duller, as if the very air was weighed down by the hopelessness inside. A place where powerful men were stripped down, ground into nothing, forgotten. A guard's voice cut through the air. "On your feet." The chains clanked as Alistair rose. He had once made men stand with a mere glance. Now, he stood because he was ordered to. The thought clawed at him, but he kept his face impassive. Showing weakness here was signing your own death sentence. One by one, the prisoners stepped off the bus. Alistair followed, his shoes, ***, no longer hand-stitched Italian leather, but standard-issue rubber soles, ***, scraping against the pavement. The hot sun beat down on him, yet he felt cold. the main gate groaned open, revealing the yard beyond. Dozens of inmates turned to look at the new arrivals. Some faces were blank, others filled with quiet amusement. Some recognized him. He could see it in the way their eyes flickered with curiosity, as if asking themselves, "Is that really him?" He had spent years building the walls that kept men like this out of his world. Now he was on the inside. As the guards led them forward, Alistair stole one last glance over his shoulder. There was no one left fighting for him. No lawyers scrambling for an appeal. No journalists calling him a misunderstood genius. No executives waiting for his orders. Just the cold certainty of the prison looming ahead, and the weight of the sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind him. And for the first time, Alistair Grayson truly understood what it meant to have nothing.